Welcome to Polity Matters, a podcast where we explore various topics in biblical church government. My name is Scott Edberg, and today I'm joined by my co-host, Jared Nelson. Ben is actually unable to be with us today, and so instead of Ben, we brought a loud Italian on the show to substitute Fred Greco. We're kind of in the middle of a hiatus in Polity Matters. We're trying to bridge the gap between the directory of worship and what we just went through, the rules of discipline. And so today we're going to have an episode that is more of like an FAQ, frequently asked questions in church government and process and things associated. But before we do, Fred, what's new with you? How are you doing?
I'm doing well, Scott. Lord is good, and we are looking forward to getting to the holiday season more than usual because Deb and I are expecting our second grandchild in the month of December. So that's a very joyous and fun expectation.
And the SJC just met last week, is that right? And so you've had a busy fall.
We did. So as I told some others, our Thursday meeting was about 14 hours long.
Oh.
So we gathered on Wednesday, met very long on Thursday, met for about 4 hours on Friday. We have a large backlog of cases. We had 18 cases. We did not get through them all. I think maybe we got through a dozen. We have another 16 or 18 in the wings that didn't have decisions yet. So March is looking just as busy.
Well, I don't envy you or anyone on the SJC for that matter. You have perhaps a unique role in the PCA. You've seen our polity probably from about every different angle. And so we're going to perhaps pepper you with questions today and think through some common questions. But you've been a ruling elder, a teaching elder, served as chairman of the SJC, moderator of the assembly. When did this all start for you? Like, how did you come into contact with PCA polity, perhaps in your earliest days?
I think I was drawn almost immediately because of the Lord's providence. So some people know that before I was in the ministry, I was en route to be an academic. Did not get a PhD, took a terminal master's in Greek and Latin, the classics, and then went to law school at the University of Michigan. Got my JD in 1996, and then went into law, working for several firms, and then later for a private startup company as a corporate attorney. And so there is a sense in which being an attorney is a lot like being a churchman or a pastor. I was a corporate guy, so I was never in court and never had to, give speeches like that. But you learn to read documents, interpret documents, compare documents, fill in the gaps of blanks, et cetera. That's what people pay you to do. And so it was really a small jump to applying those skills that I learned in Ann Arbor to applying it to, we don't have canon law, but to our Constitution and our governing documents. And so that's not just a skill set. I'm involved in that because I enjoy it. And one of the things you have to do as a corporate lawyer is try to find solutions to questions and conundrums. And that's really what a polity guy does. People don't ask me questions that are, very, very, very basic. How many months do you have to be at a PCA church in order to apply to be a candidate to the ministry? Someone can open the book, flip to chapter 18, and read 6. I get questions that kind of go off of the text. What if? How does this work? What if we had this case? And so I've been doing that now for almost 30 years. First as a ruling elder and now as a teaching elder. And you've probably heard me say this before. We've probably even heard it on this podcast. I do it because I love the church. I love to see the church flourish. And, one of the things about church polity is that if it's done badly, it can really affect in a negative way ministry. I don't think anyone's going to say that the gospel hinges on how many offices you have. But if you're not sure about that and don't know what you're doing, it can gum up the works and get in the way of ministry and shepherding and evangelism and the gospel. So I've been doing that for a while and have been blessed to have, I think, some success in that area.
We have some questions for you, but perhaps you would know this better than we would. What are some of the most common questions that you get that you feel that, man, I've answered this question 1,500 times, and it's so simple, it's just this. But like, do you get questions like that? What are some of them? And what are the answers so that you can maybe not have to answer that question anymore?
I get a lot of questions in certain areas. I get a lot of questions around elections at churches, both of elder deacon elections and pastoral elections. I get a lot of questions around, how does a pastoral search committee get started? What's the interaction between a pastoral search committee and a session? That's really unclear because a session governs a church. But the one area in which the congregation has really prominent authority is in the election of a pastor. That committee is a congregational committee. And so people are shocked when I tell them the relationship between a pastoral search committee and the session is that there is none. The session can't tell a pastoral search committee what to do, how often to meet, what, the job description is, what, how many candidates to interview, how many candidates to bring to the congregation. It's all completely independent. Now, of course, there is a provision in the book that if the congregation desires, they can elect the session as the committee in doing that. And what I often tell folks is, if you're a candidate to be a minister at a church and you don't meet with the session, talk with the session, try to find agreement and commonality with the session, you're a fool. Because the day after a pastor is called, the pastoral search committee disbands and never comes back again. And you have to deal with the session. But there's a lot of questions on that. What kind of notices need to be given? How long is the notice? And there's a lot of folks that will have questions, in that area. And that bleeds into, I get a lot of questions about congregational meetings. What kind of motions are in order? How much detail do we need to have in the agenda? How can we make a session call a congregational meeting? And the book, chapter 25, is pretty clear, but not, entirely. One of the things that I find is interesting about a congregational meeting is you can call a meeting to call or to fire a pastor on 7 weeks' notice. You need to give 30 days notice in order to elect an elder or a deacon. And my assessment from that is that's proof positive that the two main compilers, authors of our book, Jack Williamson and Bob Canada, were ruling elders. Now, obviously there's a carryover from the old PCUS book, but I think there's something to be said there in that respect. The only other area where you need 30 days notice is to leave the denomination. And that's another question I get occasionally because people wonder, what can the presbytery do to stop it? Can the presbytery be heard? And the answer is no. If it's 30 days notice, the congregation can vote and can leave. I get a fair amount of questions relating to Robert's rules, both in meetings and in session meetings and congregational meetings. So I just got this week a question from a man who's a pastor of a church saying, can I vote in the meeting? I've heard that I'm not allowed to vote. And there's a couple of provisions in Roberts, one that relates to small committees, which most sessions are, except for maybe Briarwood or First Pres Jackson. And Roberts actually says, for example, that the moderator can vote. He just often, by prudence, does not disclose his vote to keep a sense of neutrality unless his vote will change the outcome. And that's where we get kind of this rule, the moderator only votes to make or break a tie. But that's strictly speaking not true. It's just that most moderators won't announce their vote. So I'll get that question, pretty often. Questions like, how do we bring up a matter that we've already passed? They won't ask this, but I will tell them what's a motion to rescind or to amend something previously adopted, something along those lines. I'm starting to get better at church particularization. I've never been a church planter, and I've never worked for M&A. But I get a lot of calls. How do we call a meeting to particularize a church? What's the order that we need to do things in? When do we elect elders? When can we elect the pastor? Do we have to do it all at once? Can we do it all at once? And so I've had to become much more familiar with chapter 5 in order to give advice on that. And then the other thing that I get a lot of, and you can imagine, you're going to be shocked here. I get a ton of, I have this overture I'd like to bring to the assembly. Would you look at it? And that goes from, to be frank, I would, modify this, I'd modify that. This is where I think people might not agree with it, to, you do realize this has no chance of passing the assembly, right? You can do it, but I've seen this four times. This came up just the last assembly. There was another attempt. I think I'd have to go back and look at my GA document. I think it was like the fourth time since I've been in the ministry that someone's tried to amend our vows. I don't think that's ever gotten more than a literal handful of votes in the overtures committee, let alone on the assembly. The denomination's pretty solid on, we're just going to keep what we got, even apart from the merits of the changes. So those are the sorts of things, that I get. And I'm pleased to help anyone that I can. The only thing I need to be careful about is that they're BCO questions or Roberts questions, and they don't relate to a potential case or controversy because of my position on the SJC.
Yeah, well, maybe not getting into some of the details of things that people can just look up on their own. I had a couple of questions that maybe types of questions that you may get, and maybe you can speak to them in terms of wisdom or advice.
Right.
And those would be a few different categories of things. So a lot of times people break out their BCO when something bad happens in the church.
Right.
First off, what advice would you give to somebody that they have a problem with something that the session is doing, but it's fairly low level. They can't find something that they're breaking in the BCO or in the rules of standards, but they just voted to do this renovation of the sanctuary, and they don't like the way that they are planning to do it, or they're changing the time of worship from 11 a.m. to 10 a.m. and that's too early for me. Like, what about the regular duties of the session, and you have a problem with them, and they're not doing something sinful, but you disagree with them? What would be your advice to a layperson who has that problem?
Right. So think about a few high-level principles. So first, what you're describing isn't really necessarily a Matthew 18 thing. That gets confused. Someone writes an article, and then someone wants to write a counter article, and people chime in on social media. You can't do that. You can't do that. You have to talk to them first. You have to talk to them, Matthew 18. Matthew 18 is pretty clear. I have to talk to you if you sinned against me. It's a private offense. It's not a public statement. That's also the whole grab bag of what you're talking about. So we don't need to necessarily think about it in Matthew 18 terms. That's, the first thing. The second thing that we need to think about is that any act or decision of a court can be complained against. And I often will jokingly give advice. Someone will say, can I do that? Can we do that as a court? And my answer is, you can do anything you want unless somebody files a complaint. And the more outrageous it is, the more likely you're going to get a complaint. But at the same time, that's almost always not the place to start, especially in a low-level matter. So we could say, for example, here, moving the worship time from 10 to 11 is not that big of a deal, shouldn't be ecclesiastical litigation. You could file a proper BCO 43 complaint against that. It's technically an act of a court. But before you even think about doing that, you need to go talk to somebody. I always advise folks, if it's a session decision, to see if they can meet with the session and ask questions. And, because there's two things going on here, especially in these low level things. You may not know why the decision has been made. You may want to, if the time has changed from 10 to 11 and you think it's going to cut into your lunch and you don't like that, you may realize that the session has been given a request by a third of the congregation that for some reason they're unable to come until 11, right? You just don't know what you don't know. And so to find out about those things. The second thing is that don't assume that the session knows everything that could be of concern and has disregarded it. So meeting with them and explaining how this would work, you may come to them and say, listen, I've talked to a bunch of young families. If we move to 11, all of our young families are going to have difficulties because our worship's going to cut into nap time. And, what's the pro of changing the time, et cetera. And the session could say, you know what, that's a really good point. We'll have to reconsider this. And so starting on a personal level is always preferable, both because that's how we should act as Christians, and then also to get more information. Now, if it's something that's more significant, if it rises to the level of something that you think the answer is not satisfactory. So I'll give you a different example. Your church decides to stop having an evening worship service, period. That's a little bit different than changing the time or, some other matters. And if you go and talk with some elders, the pastor, and you don't get a satisfactory answer, that's something, you could bring to their attention in a more formal way. And the thing about it is a complaint, church litigation, doesn't have to be inherently hostile. You're not more likely to succeed in a complaint if you're obnoxious, or if you're yelling, or if you use inflammatory language in your filings. It could just be something as simple as, I want you formally to have to reconsider this matter. And that's why I'm doing this. And it's my right under the book. So those are, I think, a couple of examples, in doing that. Every church has this kind of push and pull. And my experience doing a lot of things in the church for 3 decades is people often understand very well what they think the problems are for themselves, what the issues would be with something, how it would affect them, and maybe don't think about other people's perspective on it. And I don't think that's malice. I just think we all have different stages of life. We all have different opinions. We all have different backgrounds. And sometimes it's resolved just simply by a conversation.
Okay. So low level, I think that's good advice to go to the person and or go to the session, ask them why they were making that decision. What if it gets to higher levels where they're just not listening and it's something that's worth pursuing beyond just the hear me out? They invite a Jehovah's Witness preacher to preach on Sunday morning. There's an accusation of abuse out there against one of the officers. There's a Sunday school teacher that's teaching something heretical, and the session isn't listening to you, and you're like, okay, I need to do a formal complaint. What's your suggestion of how do you start that process? Because I mean, the BCO says file a complaint, but how do they even think through starting to do something like that?
Right. So first of all, let me start. I think there's 2 buckets here. I think, you just raised it in your litany. I think anytime you have issues of allegations of criminality or abuse, that's a matter for the civil magistrate primarily. And you might need to, report that. If you're aware of something, report it to the civil magistrate. And I always advise sessions not to jump into the middle of that and not to upend investigations and possible criminal prosecutions. And so the reason I say that is if you hear something like that in the church and the session isn't acting quickly enough for you, you may want to ask them. It may be because the sheriff's department's involved and it's not a matter of them ignoring it. So that's the first thing. The second thing is if you want to be involved with ecclesiastical litigation, that's a complaint or you have an appeal of a judgment, I can't recommend enough getting advice from someone with experience. Now, that's usually not as hard as it sounds. So the stated clerk's office is not going to draft a complaint for you, but they will give you some advice. They'll tell you, how long you have. I know it's in the book, but sometimes it's confusing because an initial complaint, you have 60 days, an appellate complaint, you have 30 days. Who do you file with? How long can the complaint be? They can give you some advice on that and doing that. Clerk of Presbytery is also a good place to get advice, even beyond your local church. Oftentimes you might think, well, if I'm filing a complaint against the session, I certainly can't ask any of my elders because they're going to try to trip me up and make it sure that I can't file my complaint. I don't think that's the fact. And I know it's not the case for me. If someone in my church came and said, how do you do this? I would assist them in every way I could to file a complaint that would at least be administratively in order so that they could be heard. There's probably other folks at other churches that are nearby that you could ask. And then there are, just a series of people who are well known that you can go to, former members of the SJC, Sam Duncan, for example, especially if it was a complaint against something to Presbytery. Sam's been doing this longer than I've been alive, almost. And so he's a great resource. And there are other guys who have retired from the SJC who don't have any restrictions on how they can advise and do that. And so, getting advice is good because I often see in my capacity on the SJC, people file an appeal when they're really filing a complaint, people filing a complaint when they're really filing an appeal, people filing with the wrong court, people filing things that are. We had to amend the SJC manual to compel complainants to list out in numerical order the actual actions they're complaining against. Because what you would get is a 15-page narrative about everything under the sun, and you'd look at it and go, okay, what do you actually want undone? What do you want here? So I can't stress this enough, Jared, that even if you think you know what you're doing, get advice. And quite frankly, the more experienced you are, probably the more people you can ask for advice to do that.
Yeah, that's good in your local church. Now, go with me a little bit on this, not necessarily a BCO step-by-step too, but maybe you can just give a little bit of wisdom to living in a social media age. And there may be things that you come across in terms of information that didn't happen in your local church.
Right.
And I realize there may be different categories for this. There's, things that may be behavior abuse type things. There can be things that are like heresy. But, you're scrolling through Facebook, you're scrolling through whatever social media thing kids are using these days, and you come across either somebody who is alleging that some pastor somewhere abused them that's currently serving, or you come across somebody saying, so-and-so is teaching heresy and it's X, Y, and Z. Either as a layperson or even as an elder, using wisdom, how would you advise people to react when they see something like that? How should they conduct themselves when they see something like that?
So I think, first of all, if you're not someone that has jurisdictional authority, you need to understand you don't get to decide things. You don't have personal property over this. And in a sense, it's similar to what we talked about before in terms of an allegation of abuse and contacting the civil magistrate. So no one thinks if they hear an accusation of abuse that once they report it, that the prosecutor is going to come back to them for advice on how to handle it. They know that the detectives are going to go out and do their inquiry. They know that the judicial process is going to go forward. And they know that the civil magistrate doesn't even have an obligation to update them on what's going on if they're not a personal victim, right? I think it's very similar in ecclesiastical situations. So one of the key errors that I see in ecclesiastical accountability and the rules of discipline is people talk about filing a 31-2 or filing a 40-5 as if somehow that makes them a party to the case. Now, let me give you the numbers so that people aren't trying to scroll quickly through their BCO. BCO 31-2 says that a court can do an investigation of a person under their jurisdiction if there are reports concerning their Christian character. So at a session level, that would be any member. At a presbytery level, that would be teaching elders in the presbytery. And reports is very general. So the way that this has been best described to me by David Coffin is it is common fame. It is the newspaper article. It is the Facebook post. It is, rumors going around town. And someone can make a court aware of that report, but that ends where that goes. So if you were scrolling Facebook and saw something that said, Mr. Jones defrauded 30 people, you could send Mr. Jones' session a copy of that article and say, this may be something you want to look into. But you don't get to bug that session every week and say, what are you doing with it? I'd like to testify. You guys really need to get after this. No, you're done. You didn't file anything. You are not a party. If it's something that's a personal offense, you might file charges against someone. If Jared punched me, I could file charges against him for, battery. But just a report, I don't get to be in control of that. Yeah. 40-5 is not a personal matter of character. It's a court has done something unconstitutional or has violated the book in some way. And again, you can bring that to the attention of the higher court, but you don't gain standing. You don't get to tell the higher court what to do. And I think really that is at the heart of the social media buzz. People think because they saw it on X or they saw it on Facebook, it's their obligation to become one of the Avengers or to become Dick Tracy and to follow up on it and make sure things are done right. And that's just simply not the case. The court can handle that. And I have to say, and this gets people on social media really riled up, the court doesn't even have to report what it does with those reports. So a court could have a discussion about a 31-2 investigation and decide not to do an investigation. And they don't need to put that up on social media. And they don't need to report back to everyone who's contacted them that that's what they've done. And they may have very good reasons. They may have had an hour-long debate about why to do this. And so, again, if you're not responsible, if you don't have authority, you should just let the courts do their business. I think a lot of this problem, Jared, comes from people trying to act like they're the court and they're the ones responsible.
Yeah, and I think there's something to be said for if you see something that's in your local church or in your local presbytery as an officer, there's something that's a little bit more pressing for you to be like, okay, I need to look into this.
Yes.
But I've seen that before where there's been it was like 2 or 3 years ago, I saw something where there was these allegations of personal conduct. And I just said, hey, where is this coming out of? Just to myself, sent it to the clerk and said, you should be aware that this is out there. People are talking about it. And they just said, thanks for bringing our attention to that, and then moved on. Right. And because it was not in my presbytery or anything like that, and I wasn't going to engage it to give it some more clicks and likes. But sometimes people just aren't aware so I always like to think of different levels of obligation. I have a lot of obligation to my local church. Right. I have a large degree of obligation to my presbytery. I have some degree of obligation to the broader church because where there's connections there. Right. But it's if I try to trace down every single thing I saw online, that's all I would be doing with my time.
You would be preaching, yeah. And I find, I have an easier job at this than most people because any temptation I might have to interact with that runs directly contrary often to my vows as a member of the SJC.
Yeah.
And so I try to err on the side of caution, which is why, if you can go scroll through my X account, you're going to find a lot of Michigan posts, a lot of trolling and trash talking, Jason Halopoulos and Kevin DeYoung about Michigan State. You're going to find a lot of hand-wringing about the Houston Astros. I try not to get involved in that, not because these matters aren't important, but because they're important for the church to take care of, not algorithms.
Yeah.
So
There-
this has created a question from me. Say that you do receive like a 31-2 report, and the person that made the report has a personal offense within it. They get back that the presbytery found a no strong presumption of guilt, and it's a unanimous decision, but you feel wronged. What can you do additionally in that circumstance if you felt that you were actually sinned against and this was worthy of a trial?
Now, I'm going to answer that. I'm not encouraging ecclesiastical litigation, but your best constitutional response in what you've described would be to file charges under BCO 32.2. A lot of people think that you have to do an investigation first, and then if an investigation finds a strong presumption of guilt, then there can be charges. That's not true. Under our book, there are two parallel provisions. A court can undertake an investigation and bring charges on its own under 31.2, or any private individual can bring charges under 32.2. The reason why most people don't do that is because there are other provisions that say if you are known to bear animosity toward this person, if you will get, financial remuneration by the prosecution of this person, if you are a known scandalizer of the brethren, there's some defense mechanisms that kick in, if you do that. But it's my understanding that if someone files charges, the court then needs to deal with it. Now, if a court has unanimously found no strong presumption of guilt, as John Calvin says, good luck getting your charges across. But you might argue, I can bring more evidence to bear in a trial than was available to the court. So yeah, I will have a better chance, to do that. And so that's really, where you can go. And what I would say is, if you think you're wronged and you're not willing to bring charges, then you probably don't have a solid complaint that the court is not doing your bidding and prosecuting of its own accord.
What would be the limits of that indictment or charge? Like who can and who can't? Like, could I draft charges against a teaching elder in the presbytery out west, like Northern California or something? Like, do I have that liberty as a man in Ileana?
I think this is something that's unclear under our book. There are some people that think you have to be under the jurisdiction of the court in order to bring charges. There are others like myself that think you don't need to be. So I would say you could bring those charges. However, it would be up to the court to appoint the prosecutor. Now, they might well voluntarily make you the voluntary prosecutor because, number one, then they don't have to get somebody else to do it. Number two, you have a vested interest. And number three, there's a warning in the book that if your charges are slight, that you might be found a slanderer of the brethren. That's one of the reasons why people don't want to bring charges. They're afraid it's going to blow back on them if they don't. Now, it doesn't say if the person is found not guilty.
Yeah.
It's basically if it's found to be, frivolous, if, there's not probable cause is the language. And that's a term of art. There's no percentage there, right? That's BCO 31-9. I also think that I don't think there's an explicit limitation as to who may assist in being a assistant or an advisor. I believe that any member in good standing in the PCA can assist a prosecution. Which means that, again, if someone feels they've been wronged but has no clue about how to work the process, again, it gets back to my earlier advice. Find someone who knows how to do this. Find someone that can advise you. And that might be helpful because the person who's giving advice may say, you do realize that this charge you got isn't really a sin. You may not like it, but it's not really a chargeable offense. There's a difference between I didn't like this and it's a chargeable. I'm mad because we had a church dinner and Bob never spoke to me the whole time during the dinner. Well, like, that's not a chargeable offense. That may be something you'd have to go talk to Bob about, but figure that out. So someone who's advising could help you there. Or if it is something that is a chargeable offense, someone who's advising you could say, okay, these 3 points are really what you are charging the person with, and would go in the indictment, and we need to find specifications, because Joe lied to me. Okay, on which occasions did Joe lie to you? What's the, where are you actually giving the specifics of that violation of the 9th commandment, for example?
Yeah.
So I really want to push this ambiguity, I think, a little bit. There has to be an end, right? Like, not, can anyone or everyone bring charges? Some random guy in New York City, can he litigate a case, not a member of a PCA church, outside of my jurisdiction? Maybe he's a Catholic or something too. Let's just make it even muddier.
Yeah.
What is the limits? Where can we say, okay, we're not going to receive charges from X, Y, or Z, like this kid's great-grandson or something?
I don't have a strict sentence in the book to show to you on this, but I believe a good place to find a limitation would be someone being a member in good standing of the PCA. Now, I think it's easier to say, a Muslim can't bring charges, an atheist can't bring charges, a non-Christian can't bring charges, because right now they can't even testify as a witness. So I don't know how you could be a prosecutor if you don't even qualify as a witness. If we're talking about a member of Second Baptist Church, that might get a little bit muddier. But I would still say that if you're going to be involved in our church courts, you have to have some level of standing within the PCA. And so, again, I'm much broader in my interpretation than others. Others would say, if you're going to bring a charge against a teaching elder, you got to be a member of that presbytery. I'm a little bit broader, but I would say it has to be someone who is a member of the PCA. And we haven't pronounced something on this in a judgment at the SJC, but I do know there have been cases where we have adjudicated cases where charges were brought against teaching elders from non-members of the presbytery, from members of a church. I can't remember off the top of my head whether they would be a church in the presbytery or not, but that's where I would draw the line.
Yeah, and that would be a get out of jail free card if somebody, a pastor hit somebody, but hey, they weren't a part of the PCA, that you can still investigate that. You can still bring reports about that. It's just they're not formally filing charges. And we would hope that the presbytery would care about that enough to pursue it.
That's right. And remember, our system of checks and balances is pretty robust. So let's say, for example, a pastor punched someone, and the presbytery either declined to do a 31-2 investigation. That's a decision under 43. Or they had a vote and they voted down a motion to do a 31-2. That would be an action or a decision that could be complained against by anyone who had standing. So in that instance, any member of the presbytery or any ruling elder commissioner. So, it is possible, I suppose, that you would have an instance like that, where it would be clear cut and obvious that something should be done, and everyone unanimously didn't want to do anything about it. And then you'd trigger, one of my least favorite provisions in the book for its vagueness and uselessness, and that's BCO 34:1. If other presbyteries found out about this, they might be aghast that, the boxing pastor is still allowed to do what he wants to do. and they could, at least at first petition the presbytery to do something, and then secondly, try to petition the General Assembly to take original jurisdiction. So it would be difficult to completely avoid responsibility. I'm not saying it couldn't be done, but not easily.
Well, another area though that I think that you and I talked about a little bit before you're coming on, of questions that you get a lot, unless I'm stepping on Scott's toes and he wants to grill you more about original jurisdiction, is I imagine you get a lot of questions about what does the BCO say about property?
I do.
So they're going to buy property, they're going to sell property. When does the congregation get involved? What are some things that would be good to know if a church is in that process? They're about to buy property, or about to build, or they're about to sell a piece of property. What's your advice to them of what they should be thinking about?
Yeah, I get a lot of these, partly because of, my BCO reputation, but also because being a corporate lawyer. And actually, one of the things I did when I was a lawyer was real estate law. And what I try to, in a kind of a 30,000 foot view, what I try to remind people who are asking this is, if you are doing any kind of a decision about property that you think requires congregational approval, it probably does. Now, it may not. I mean, you could be a church that owns 30 properties worth $50 million, and you're trying to sell, a small piece of property worth 10 grand to someone. You probably don't need congregational approval for that. You probably could just have sessional approval. But in the main, if you're buying property, you're selling property, or I think even if you're mortgaging property, it is important to get approval from both the congregation in a congregational meeting and in a corporate meeting. Now, the good news for people is the members of the corporation are identical to the communing members of the congregation. So you don't even have to call a second meeting. But you have to understand you've got two different structures. So on the congregational side, you've got congregational members. You've also got officers. You've got deacons advising, and a session making decisions or making recommendations, bringing a motion to the floor, for example. We want the congregation to approve this $20 million loan, something like that, right? On the corporate side, you have the members, but you've also got the trustees. And that is a little bit muddier. The one thing that I can tell you with absolute certainty, because I've looked at it and it affects me, is that ministers cannot be trustees or chairmen of the board of a congregation. They're ineligible. You must be a member. And so I'm the most experienced corporate lawyer on our session, although we have another guy who's a great lawyer. I've just been doing it a little bit longer. I'm not one of our trustees because I can't be, right? And so some churches will just make their session the trustees. And if you have changeover in the session, you update that. Some will make deacons their trustees. Some will make it a mixed bag of the elders and deacons. And there's no reason why, an unordained member couldn't be a trustee. So you do that. But the trustees normally need to approve these kinds of decisions. So the packet that I send to folks is, you need to have a congregational meeting. You need to have a motion you're going to approve for whatever you're going to do, sell the property for no less than X dollars, mortgage the property for no more than Y dollars, whatever. And you need to have your session approve it in a session meeting, bring it to the congregation, have the congregation approve it. But then I always say, you do know your bank may not even care about that. Your bank wants to know that the corporation's approved it. So what we do is we have a congregational meeting, we approve this, and then I close the congregational meeting in prayer, and I say, stop, don't go anywhere. Everybody stay in their seats. And then I bring up the president of our corporation, who's one of our ruling elders, and he convenes a meeting in the corporation, same people. We put the exact same motion in front of them, and they approve it. And then, because this is what lawyers do, we also make sure that any officers, presidents, vice presidents, et cetera, in an officer written action, they approve the motion. And our trustees, they approve the motion in writing. And then whatever the bank asks for, whatever the seller or the buyer asks for, we're good legally. We don't need to come back. And usually problems crop up when people are not thorough, when they don't think they have to do this, et cetera. And so I always advise to be conservative and to get as much approval as you can, because you never know when somebody's going to ask for a document or an approval.
All right, Scott, this is your chance. Your church actually deals with this stuff, and
Yeah,
mine
the
hasn't for a while.
Archdiocese of Providence Presbyterian, we have a lot of property for our 100 member size because we've had different visions over the years. And so I'm constantly buying, selling, and mortgaging property. It's kind of an odd thing I never expected in the ministry. We've taken it kind of like as a piece by piece basis. We have two properties, and we have a building that we just bought. That's where I'm currently recording. We are trying to sell one of those properties, and we have kind of tried to be kind to our congregation in showing them this isn't kind, I guess this is what you should do, is showing them their rights and responsibilities in this. And instead of making it just a simple broad motion where we meet once and you never have to do it again, we kind of take individual opportunities as they are, because not all of our properties are even for sale, but that doesn't necessarily mean we're unopen to selling X property or land. And so we have found that gathering the congregation together to consider an offer, just a general offer, we don't typically get too far into the weeds of contracts and all of that, because you can't have too many cooks in that kitchen. But having the opportunity for your congregation to have a general sense of what they're doing as a corporation, I think is helpful to them. Like, we were selling this property, Pastor Scott, but what is that money to be used for?
Right.
We have a $200,000, $300,000 note. Is that when we sell this land, we'll pay back the note? What are you thinking on this? Are you going to raise more money? It's, I think, helpful for congregations and their leaders, session, board of trustees, and et cetera, to be thoroughly transparent with what they intend to do with their decisions concerning money, especially these large sums.
Yes.
Like Fred said, like $10,000, that's not typically what's in view here when you're selling property. You're talking about, $400,000 a transaction. Well, what will the church do with that transaction? Will we raise our roof, or will we pay down our mortgage? And so there's sometimes debate, that can arise from that internally on the session or as well as the congregation. And so being, I think, expressly transparent with your goals in the midst of why we are even considering offers on land, I think is helpful for the congregation. But we've done all of this. In my old Dutch church, there's an interesting precedent where instead of going to the bank for notes, they would actually have private notes from within the congregation. And so my question is for our esteemed lawyer, is that wise? And should churches seek to avoid corporate banks by making themselves the banks with private members? What are some concerns or benefits of doing that?
Well, I think if a congregation was going to do that, the very first thing that I would do, and this sounds counterintuitive, is I would make sure that I have some kind of independent third-party reviewable documentation that covers it. I'd probably hire an attorney, maybe even hire an attorney for the congregation and let the individual hire an attorney for a couple of reasons. So first, that the lender can't use that as leverage to get things done in the church that aren't property related. But then secondly, so that the lender is protected if something happens and the congregation becomes insolvent, so that he has creditors' rights as opposed to, the utility companies and others. So, to do that. I think it can be done, but it has to be carefully done. And, there needs to be some frank conversations about, what would happen if you didn't get paid this back? What would happen if the member were to pass away and his heirs would want to be paid out right away? Well, again, you'd want that covered by some documentation in doing that. And one of the things that I think is important here, but especially in what we were just discussing, is the PCA has a very unique polity with respect to property. So people need to know that the congregation itself does not have individual authority about the property and finances of the church. So the congregation can't vote to only keep $300,000 in the savings account and no more.
Mm-hmm.
That's a session decision. The other side to it, though, is the property of the church belongs to the congregation, its corporation. And the session can't give away, sell, do something to devolve property away from the congregation without their consent. So there's kind of an ultimate right there.
Mm-hmm.
Within the congregation, the session under ecclesiastical authority rules and makes decisions, but it can't make those decisions ultimately. In other words, as in my example, the congregation can't vote to only keep $300,000 in the bank, but the session can't vote to give the entirety of the savings account away to a foreign mission board. Right? That would, I think, be violative of BCO 25. And that's really unusual. That's different than not just denominations like the PCUS. That's different than the OPC and the ARP and the RPCNA. And this is a direct result of the property controversies in the mainline denomination in the late 60s and early 70s. That's the only section of the BCO that is unamendable and inviolable and any other adjective you want to throw at it. You cannot mess with that. And so explaining that sometimes to congregants is helpful because they may not be aware of that. Unless they're, Presbyterian history buffs, they may not be aware of that stricture.
Yeah. And there has to be some sort of provision too for, smaller amounts. There's a church in our presbytery that they were getting rid of their old chairs and they were really nice. And so we took them, but they had no congregational meeting for that. That wasn't property at a higher enough level that we need to call a congregational meeting because we're going to give them 24 of our chairs.
No, but I bet you that what they had was they probably had a motion in session that did that. And so this gets back to our earlier point. So let's say they had a motion in session to give you all the chairs. That's not outside of accountability. Any member of the congregation could have filed a complaint against that action. Now, that's not going to happen very likely. But the point is, it's not done in secret. It's not, there's not some pinky swear compact. It's done, if it's an action of a court and it's recorded in the minutes, it's public. And so there's accountability there.
Yeah. Well, I do have a final question, and we can see if Scott has any that just things he wanted to throw at the go-to polity guy. But I just wanted to ask you this because the very first time I think that I went to you for advice on something was this question. I'll see if you remember what your response was. But I was about to be moderator of Ascension Presbytery, and I went to you and I said, what advice can you give to me as a new moderator? And I think you've had some experience at all levels of that. So if you're thinking of somebody, whether they've just got a call to a new church, moderator of a session, or they just got voted into the role of a moderator of presbytery, or even we'll assume the next moderator of GA next year is watching this, because it could be different advice at those different levels. What advice would you give to somebody who's just is realizing I'm going to be a moderator now of a court?
I do get this a lot. I even had this last year before our excellent moderator. I gave him a few pointers. And so there's a couple of things. The first and most important is if you are moderating a meeting, in the main, you are a traffic cop. You are allowing other people to speak. You don't need to be interjecting all the time, trying to drive the discussion, trying to take over the discussion. Now, that's going to be less the case in like a small session, for example, right? I mean, in our session, which is not huge, there's probably 8 voting members at a given time. I feel free to speak, although I try to let the others get in as much as they want. In a bigger crowd, like when I chaired overtures, I never said anything substantively. When I've been moderator of presbytery, I never say anything substantively. Same thing when I moderated at the General Assembly. And what you need to understand if you're going to be a moderator is that in God's providence, the points that you wanted made, someone else will make. And your job is to keep things moving smoothly and give people opportunities to speak so that the discussion goes forward. Your job as the moderator is not to come to a certain result. That is totally not your job. And the sooner you realize that, the better you are. The second thing that I tell folks is to be decisive. When a motion comes up, you don't say, oh, wait a minute here. I'm going to have to do a study and spend 10 minutes looking through Roberts and let me email my 4 best friends and figure. No, you try to do as much as you can and you make a decision. And I will say to folks, if you don't like the decision, appeal the ruling of the chair. I'm not going to get upset. That's your right. I don't think you're attacking me. You just don't like the decision. And then the body can vote. And I'll tell you, Jared, I've seen occasions at the General Assembly level where the moderator has made the wrong decision, and I can point in Roberts where it was wrong, and they were upheld by the body, and we took the wrong decision. That's the way it works. That's how it is. And so do that. Now, then the third thing that I would say is do some homework. This may be a little bit of a secret, so maybe, I'm giving out my secret. There are about a dozen important decisions, motions, etc., that you probably need to near memorize. How many levels of an amendment can you have? What's the vote that you need to move the previous question? You get that and you get a laminated cheat sheet you can buy off Amazon. You're set for the most part. If it's something that is really in the weeds, you probably have an instance where if we're in the body, I've got my copy of Roberts open. Howie's got his copy of Roberts open. John White's got his copy of Roberts open, and we're looking to find the provision, right? And so you're probably not going to have someone in, the body that's going to stand up and quote a really obscure provision that may apply. And if they do, and they can point it out, good for them. Then you say, okay, the point of order is well taken. The flip side to it is, I'll explain to people, that's what I do on the floor. I was trying to think about this. The last time at a General Assembly that I spoke substantively to a matter that didn't involve an overture that I drafted, probably a decade or more. But the guys at my church, and probably you guys know, one of the first things I do when I show up at General Assembly is my wife and I take a romantic walk to the Assembly Hall and hold hands, and I figure out where I'm going to sit, near which microphone. And I'm on top of a microphone because I'm up and down, up and down, up and down. And it's almost always point of order. Don't we need to do this? Point of order. Don't we have to take this first? And that's just to keep us moving. I'm not trying to manipulate the process at all. And sometimes I'll stand up, someone will question the moderator's ruling, and I'll stand up to, speak for the moderator in that point of order or the challenge of the chair. So, as I've said, don't try to influence the decision. Be a traffic cop. Know the main rules and be decisive, because it's like blood in the water. If you are hemming and hawing and don't know what you're doing, people are going to question every decision you make.
Mm-hmm. One more question, because this gets a little out of the BCO and back into Roberts. We've spent a lot of time in BCO and trying to understand their provisions, but there's a lot of our policy and procedures that the BCO is absent on, and we do as a court based on Roberts Rules of Order. And one of those is executive sessions. And so when is it appropriate and inappropriate to enter into executive session?
Okay, so the short answer is anytime the body votes to go into executive session, you have to. Now, I think the question beneath that question is, well, what would be a good topic to do that? So understanding executive session and its strictures would be helpful to that. Most people don't understand this. What happens in executive session is covered under secrecy. So anything said or done that doesn't need to be reported out in an action may not be discussed with anyone else outside the body. So if you're a pastor and you're in executive session You can't talk with your session members who were not at that meeting about what happened. It's so strict that the SJC changed its manual a few years back to go with something called closed session, which is not the same level of secrecy. And so we could divulge decisions, maybe the general tenor of debate, but not say, Scott said X and Jared answered and said Y. You can't do that. But so if it's something that you are concerned, none of it should get out of, you should be in executive session. But if it's just something that you think maybe we shouldn't have people, sitting in the gallery, I would say not to go into executive session unless, someone could stand up. You could be in regular debate and someone could stand up and throw a bombshell out. And if they did, probably the first thing I would do is stand up and say, Mr. Moderator, I move we go into executive session given this. Let's not even discuss what this gentleman just said. Let's go into executive session and do that. But you have to realize that, there is there's disciplinary action that can be taken for violating executive session, both under Roberts by letter of the law, and then presumably under our rules of discipline.
You mentioned the point of secrecy, which I think is 9 in Roberts. I'm wondering, so you said there's a limitation on non-attending ruling elders. What about non-attending teaching elders? Would your secrecy be bound to not disclosing the information of that executive session with them? They're members of the court, but absent from the meeting.
That's a good question. And so as you're talking this, I'm firing up my handy dandy Robert's Rules of Order program, which I advise.
I've won if I forced you to open that. That is a success on this podcast.
Anyone who is going to do any kind of parliamentary stuff, it's like $30 or $40 well spent. I've described this to other people. The interface is like Windows 95, but it's got everything that you would that you would have or want to be able to find it. Let's see. Anything that occurs in executive session, this is Roberts 926, may not be divulged to non-members except any entitled to attend. So I would take that as if you're a teaching elder, but just not at the meeting, you would have been entitled to attend, then you could, you would be entitled to that information.
And
because
so
you would also, I think, as a teaching elder, be entitled to review the executive session minutes that would have to be approved.
Yeah, I know there's been some debate in the clerks chat for the PCA on how do we handle these sorts of minutes, and so I just was curious on your advice on it. And so it seems that since ruling elders are not, their churches are members, representative members of the court, but individuals are not necessarily, that they wouldn't be privy to that. And so perhaps the difficulty then is like, how do you approve these at a different meeting if some of the people elected to serve on the court weren't members of the prior court because of their church attendance?
Yeah. I mean, my guess is anytime a ruling elder is a commissioner, he is entitled to information at that meeting. And so the approval of the executive session minutes would be an item. Now, this is really getting in the weeds, but I would say that they could approve the minutes, but it would not be appropriate to have a discussion during the approval of the minutes of matters that were discussed in executive session that don't need approval in the minutes.
Yeah, because at that point you're divulging they'll be in your normal minutes.
That's correct. That's correct. Yeah. And now a court always can lift the secrecy by a motion to amend something previously adopted. So you can do that. So again, this is for the reasons of reputation, secrecy, etc. It's not to hide things. So if someone thought this was a conspiracy to hide things, they could simply make a motion to lift executive session secrecy. And that would be in and of itself a public act that people could observe who voted for and who voted against it.
Well, Jared, that's all of my random questions. Jared really wants me to bring this home. I can just tell in his eyes. Thanks. It's always great to have you on, Fred. I know that you've been a help to me personally, but to the broader denomination as well. If you want to support our podcast, in the show notes, you'll see a link to buy me a coffee. It helps keep the lights on for our production, and any other links regarding our whereabouts on social media or churches will also be in the show notes. Thank you for coming on, Fred. And as
Yes,
James
thanks.
Bannerman would say, this podcast is over. Say goodbye, gentlemen.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.